It was past midnight when Chris and I left the old 24-hour diner at the edge of town. We had spent the evening catching up over burgers and coffee, talking about high school memories and future plans that would likely never materialize. As we strolled toward my car parked a little further down the block, Chris slowed his pace. I glanced over and noticed him rubbing his temples. He was pale. "Everything okay, man?" I asked, half jokingly. "Too much greasy diner food." Chris shook his head, wincing as he leaned against a nearby lamppost. "No, it's different," he mumbled. "Everything's spinning." He grimaced, clutching his stomach as he swayed on his feet. I rushed over and grabbed him by the arm just as his legs gave out. His breathing was ragged, each breath shallow and strained. A jolt of panic shot through me. I wasn't sure what was happening, but it was more than just a bad burger. "Come on," I said, guiding him toward the car. "We need to get you to the hospital." We barely made it to the passenger seat before he collapsed completely. I managed to push him inside, buckling his seatbelt as his head lolled against the window. His breathing had grown faint, his skin cold. I didn't waste any more time. I jumped into the driver's seat and sped toward the hospital. The roads were empty, the entire town blanketed in a pale bluish light that made everything look strangely surreal. When the hospital finally came into view, I pulled up to the emergency entrance and skidded to a stop. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and I half-dragged, half-carried Chris inside. The bright fluorescent lights inside the emergency room burned my eyes as I shouted for help. A nurse and a security guard rushed over immediately. Chris was placed on a gurney and whisked away into a triage room. I tried to follow, but the nurse held up a hand. "You need to stay in the waiting room, sir. Someone will come speak to you soon." Reluctantly, I turned back and made my way into the waiting room. It was a small, uninviting space, lined with rows of faded plastic chairs. The harsh lighting overhead buzzed like a hive of angry bees, casting a cold, sterile glow over everything. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, with a hint of something stale, like old coffee or cheap hospital food. The reception desk sat at the far end of the room, cluttered with stacks of paperwork and a dusty computer monitor. Behind the desk, a tired-looking receptionist typed away, with little enthusiasm, barely glancing up as I entered. She looked like she had been working the night shift for years, with deep shadows under her eyes and a weary slump in her posture. A glass partition separated her from the waiting area, with a small sliding window used to speak to patients. Aside from the receptionist, there were only a few other people scattered around the room. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled jacket sat slumped in a chair, staring blankly at the floor tiles, his face pale and drawn. Across from him, a young woman scrolled through her phone, her foot tapping rhythmically against the leg of the chair. In the far corner, an elderly woman with a hunched back knitted quietly, her lips moving as she murmured to herself, though I couldn't make out the words. The wall-mounted TV flickered above, showing a muted news broadcast with closed captions scrolling across the screen. Next to it, a clock ticked irregularly, the second hand jerking with each movement as though struggling to keep time. The room itself seemed caught in some liminal state. I chose a seat near the corner, trying to calm my breathing. My heart was still racing from the rush to the hospital. The seat beneath me was stiff and uncomfortable, offering little relief from the tension gripping my body. I shifted, trying to find a better position, when I felt something crinkle under my leg. Frowning, I reached down and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper that had been wedged into the chair. It was old and yellowed at the edges, like it had been left there for a while. Curious, I unfolded the paper and smoothed it out on my lap. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry or panicked. The list was numbered, and as I began to read, I couldn't help but feel a mix of surprise and amusement at what was written there. Rule 1. Avoid making eye contact with the receptionist between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. I raised an eyebrow. That seemed oddly specific. Why would anyone write something like that? I glanced over at the receptionist, who was still tapping away at her keyboard, oblivious to the rest of the room. Was this some kind of prank? The idea made me smirk a little, despite the heaviness in the air. Rule 2. Never walk past the reception desk without greeting the receptionist after 2:30 a.m. I let out a short, dry laugh. So, I'm supposed to be polite now? I muttered under my breath, shaking my head. It was all so ridiculous. Maybe someone had written this as a joke to mess with the people stuck here at odd hours, bored out of their minds. I could imagine some bored night shifters scribbling out these rules as a way to pass the time. Rule 3. If a visitor arrives asking for directions, do not help them. I paused. That one was strange. It carried a different weight compared to the others. Who wouldn't help someone lost in a hospital, of all places? Rule 4. If you hear your friend's voice calling from down the hallway, do not leave the waiting room to look for them. The amusement drained from my expression. I felt a chill run up my spine, as if the temperature in the room had just dropped a few degrees. I glanced toward the dimly lit hallway that led to the ER rooms. It seemed to stretch into darkness. I shook my head, pushing the thought away. This list was just some random nonsense, wasn't it? I continued reading, my curiosity now tinged with unease. Rule 5. If a power outage occurs, stay seated and do not move. Rule 6. If a door that should be locked is found open, close it immediately and do not look inside. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I couldn't explain why, but each rule seemed to grow darker, more foreboding as I read on. It wasn't just the content of the rules. It was the way they were written, as if someone were trying to warn me. Rule 7. Do not look through the glass doors leading to the courtyard after 4 a.m. Rule 8. If you feel a sudden chill, do not look over your shoulder. That one made me swallow hard. There was something inherently unsettling about the thought of a chill creeping up on you from behind, and not being able to turn around to see what or who might be there. I couldn't help but glance behind me, but there was nothing there. Just the same sterile room, with its faded chairs and buzzing lights. I reached the last rule, and for some reason, my heart beat a little faster. Rule 9. If a security guard tells you it's time to leave, check the clock before listening. It's safe to leave after 6 a.m. My gaze flicked up to the wall-mounted clock, its second hand twitching with every tick. It read 1:30 a.m. At the bottom of the paper, written in shaky red ink, were the words, "Trust me." I learned the hard way. There was a dark, crusted stain on the corner, one that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I rubbed my fingers over the words, feeling the rough texture of the ink beneath my skin. I couldn't help but let out a short, nervous laugh. What kind of place is this? I whispered to myself. I slumped back in the chair. It was hard to shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, but I forced myself to dismiss it as a weird prank. The list couldn't actually mean anything, just someone's twisted idea of a joke. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes, trying to calm my thoughts. A part of me couldn't stop thinking about Chris and the way he had collapsed in the parking lot. The quiet hum of the waiting room wrapped itself around me, making the place feel even more isolating. That's when I heard it. My name, spoken in a low, barely audible voice that seemed to drift down the hallway. Adam. Adam. My eyes shot open and my body tensed. The voice was unmistakable. It was Chris. I jerked my head toward the corridor leading to the ER rooms, but there was no one in sight. Just the pale overhead lights flickering. The voice came again, a little louder this time. Adam, help me. I jumped up from the chair, the sound of my name sending shivers down my spine. My feet were already moving before I realized it. I took a few steps into the hallway. I glanced back at the waiting area, now a few steps behind me. The other visitors, still scattered about, seemed completely unaware, oblivious to the voice echoing down the hall. Adam. Chris's voice was more desperate now, laced with pain. I took another step down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the floor. As I walked deeper into the corridor, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed louder, some of them flickering out completely, leaving long stretches of darkness. The ER rooms lined the sides of the hallway, their doors slightly ajar. I hesitated as I reached one of the open doorways. I peered inside and immediately wished I hadn't. There, standing in the center of the dimly lit room, was a man in a patient's gown, facing me. The man's head moved in quick, jerking motions, shaking from side to side so rapidly that I couldn't make out any details. It was just a blur, a sickening blur. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang.